One of the traditions of Shavuos is that on the first night, we have a Tikkun Lal Shavuot. Tikkun means the repair or fixing. Lal, the evening. Shavuos is the name of the holiday. And a Tikkun Lal Shavuot, how do we repair or fix things? By the study of Torah. So it's a tradition on Shavuos, right out on the first night, right after Mariv, for people to learn together. So here's our program. Cantor's going to share with us a song related to the holiday. Then I have a teaching I'd like to share with you. And then the Cantor will finish up with a second song. So let's dive right into it.
Chag Sameach. So the first song I'm going to share with you, the title of it is Al Tifke'i le'ozvech, and treat me not to leave thee, which is from chapter 1 in the book of Ruth. So I'm going to give you a brief introduction on this, and then I'll sing the song. And I'll quote a little bit of the first chapter of Ruth in doing so. In the first chapter of the book of Ruth, traditionally chanted in synagogues on the second day of Shavuot, tragedy strikes. The scene is the land of Moab during the time of the judges. Naomi, a Jew, is widowed when her husband Elimelech dies. 10 years later, both of her sons die, leaving her with two childless, widowed daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth, both Moabite women. Naomi, now with nothing left, no progeny, no one to care for her in her old age, decides to return to her homeland, to Israel, and to the town of Bethlehem, where the famine that forced her and her family to flee is now over. In one of the more well-known scenes in the Bible, she turns to her two daughters-in-law and she says, "Turn back, my daughters. Why should you go with me? Have I any more sons in my body who might be husbands for you? Turn back, my daughters, for I am too old to be married. Even if I thought there was hope for me, even if I were married tonight, and I also bore sons, should you wait for them to grow up? Should you, on their account, debar yourselves from marriage? Oh no, my daughters, my lot is far more bitter than yours, for the hand of the Lord has struck out against me." So Orpah does turn back and she departs, but Ruth responds to Naomi the following, and we know these words so well. Ruth says, "Do not urge me to leave you, to turn back and not follow you, for wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Thus and more may the Lord do to me if anything but death parts me from you." Ruth's pledge to Naomi becomes the consummate statement of loyalty, devotion, and faithfulness. She cleaves to Naomi, insisting on returning to Israel with her. I have always wondered, why? What does Ruth stand to gain in going to Israel with her mother-in-law? And why does she feel this fierce loyalty to Naomi? In considering these questions, I remembered a scene from an old movie, An Officer and a Gentleman. While being drilled with brutal and humiliating training exercises, the recruit is repeatedly told by the officer, "I want your DOR," which means drop on request, to drop out. To which the recruit responds, "Don't do it. I ain't got no place else to go." Is Ruth in fact in a similar situation, that she has no family or home to return to? It's not clear. She obviously feels a deep attachment to Naomi. On the other hand, Ruth has no guarantee that she will find a husband in Israel or give birth to children there. She was barren for the 10 years she was married. Still, she insists on traveling to Israel with Naomi. And more, Ruth pledges to adopt both the God and the faith of the Jewish people. In so doing, She creates the model of conversion to Judaism for all future generations. The story of the relationship between Naomi and Ruth is truly the only friendship in the entire Bible centered on the deep bond between two women. For that singular reason, the story of Ruth becomes that much more beloved and enduring. Both at the time she leaves Moab and the time she arrives in Bethlehem, Naomi is full of bitterness for all she has lost. This is Ruth chapter 1, verses 20 and 21. "Do not call me Naomi," she says. "Call me Mara, for Shaddai, God, has made my lot very bitter. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. How can you call me Naomi when the Lord has dealt harshly with me, when Shaddai has brought misfortune upon me?" Naomi does not acknowledge Ruth's presence, her companionship, her loyalty to Naomi when saying, "I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty." It is even more striking, given Naomi's negativity and bad attitude. She blames God for her misfortune, that Ruth has pledged her devotion both to Naomi and to Naomi's God. What is Ruth's motivation, the source of her loyalty to Naomi? Ruth hopes to perpetuate the name of her deceased husband, Machlon, through a child she hopes to have, and also provide someone to care for Naomi in old age in that same offspring. Truly, the source of Ruth's desire to follow Naomi is their bond, their friendship. Ruth pledges her devotion to Naomi in Moab, remains steadfast throughout the story, and in fact, does provide for her mother-in-law, both in terms of sustenance and progeny. So here is a beautiful melody for Ruth's famous words, "Do not urge me to leave you," by Cantor Lawrence Avery. אל תבכי לעוזבך, לשוב לשוב מאחרייך. כי אל אשר תלכי אלך, ובאשר תליני עלים. עמך אני ואלוהיך אלוהי. עמך אני ואלוהיך אלוהי. באשר תמותי אמות, ושם ושם אקבר. כה יעשה אדוני לי, וכה יוסיף, וכה יוסיף. כי המוות יפריד בני ובנך.
Beautiful. Yishar Koch. So here's the scene. It's Shavuos, the very first Shavuos. It's 7 weeks since the Exodus. The Israelites are at Mount Sinai. And Moses goes up to the mountain, and God appears in the mountain, on the mountain. And there is smoke, and there is fire, and there is lightning, and there is noise. And the people are at the foot of the mountain. And ultimately, God is going to give the Israelites the 10 Commandments. But here's the key question. What exactly did the Israelites hear at Mount Sinai? Now, the obvious answer is, well, they heard the 10 Commandments. And the 10 Commandments constitute 172 words in Hebrew. I want you to imagine this. These are people who are at the foot of a huge mountain that is shaking, and that there's smoke and fire, there's lightning, there's thunder, there's incredible noise. And suddenly they hear the voice of God as clear as possible, saying 172 words. And how do we know this? Well, the Torah says, "Vayedaber Elohim et kol hadvarim ha'eleh." God spoke all these words. And then we continue with the 10 Commandments. What happened was this rare, once in 2,000 years, once in history, national experience. What's amazing is that the Israelites had 3 of these experiences within 2 months. There was the 10th plague. Remember that night? There's blood on the door. The angel of God goes over the Israelite houses. They're screaming and yelling from the Egyptian houses. Ultimately, the people bake matzah and they leave. That night was an incredible moment. And then just 7 days later, they're at the Red Sea, the Yam Suf, and they have another incredible moment where miraculously they escape and the Egyptians are drowned. And then not too long after that, several weeks, we have the third moment where God actually speaks these 172 words to the Israelites at Mount Sinai. I'm wondering, is it possible that there are modern such national experience moments once in 2,000 years? Maybe you could say David Ben-Gurion on May 14th, 1948, proclaiming the state of Israel was such a moment. Or maybe for those of us who remember when Sadat flew to Israel and peace was made between Egypt and Israel. Maybe Entebbe was such a moment. Or on the flip side of things, maybe the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin was such a moment, just like it was for Americans when JFK was assassinated. So here's the thing. The Israelites are at the foot of the mountain. God gives them the 10 Commandments. They hear the voice of God. God commanded. The Israelites accepted the obligations. And ultimately, there was a covenant, a deal, an agreement that was entered into. So since these 172 words came from God, every detail is critical. The important thing is not why God said it, but who said it. It comes from God. Religion, Judaism, then, if you believe this story, it's obeying God's commands. And hopefully by obeying God's commands, God will fulfill his part of the bargain, of the deal, of the covenant, which is, we read about it in chapter 19 of Exodus, verse 5. God says, "If you obey me faithfully and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all the peoples." So God says, you do this, and if you do, here's your reward. You will be special to me. Well, here's the problem with believing the story that way. Number one, we weren't there. We didn't have that experience. So I guess we're left with ultimately either we take it on faith or we assume it's a fairy tale. It doesn't apply to us. And whatever the book says, the people obligated themselves to perform, we don't feel under any such obligations. If you're a person of faith, and if you buy it, then you buy the Midrash, which says all Jews were at Mount Sinai, not just the ones that left Egypt, but every Jew, whoever would be, he was there at Egypt. So at Sinai, after we left Egypt, and we were part of that agreement. So it's binding on us as well. So 172 words. I am the Lord your God. You shall not have other gods beside me. Shall not take the name of God in vain. Remember the Sabbath day. Honor your father and mother. Do not murder. Do not commit adultery. Do not steal. Do not bear false witness. Do not covenant. The 10 Commandments. And the view that the Israelites heard every word of it. But there's another theory. The second theory says that all the Israelites heard were the first 2 commandments, not all 10, just the first 2. Right? I am the Lord your God. You shall not have any other gods beside me. If that's the case, then they didn't hear 172 words. All they heard were God speaking 59 words. How do we know this? Well, in Exodus chapter 20, verse 15, right after the commandments, we read the following. When the people saw it, they fell back and stood at a distance. You speak to us, they said to Moses, and we will obey. But let not God speak to us, lest we die. They were so petrified by the voice of God that they ran away, literally. Rashi's commentary to that verse, which is based on the Talmud in Shabbat 88b, which is based on the Midrash in Mechelta, says this: V'ya'amdu me'rachok. They stood from afar. They drew back 12 mil. A mil was a Roman or a Talmudic age measure. It's about 2/3 of a mile. So in other words, they heard God speak these words, these 59 words. They were so petrified, they turned and they ran away about 8 miles. And then ultimately, we're told the ministering angels came to assist them to return back. So the angels had to convince the Jews, don't be afraid, it's okay, you can go back, right? So that's the second idea that we have here. Now, there's something, where do we get this notion that it was just the first 2 commandments that they heard? Where'd they make that up? Well, in the Talmud, in Makot 23b, we're told a famous statement that Rabbi Simlai says, in the Torah, there are 613 commandments. Rabbi Simlai was the first rabbi who ever came up with that number. The number is significant because it's made up of 365 thou shalt nots, 365 the days of the year, plus you add to that number 248 thou shalts, and that's the positive number of mitzvot. 248, people believe that there were 248 parts of the body. In antiquity, that was the belief. Whether that's true medically today, I couldn't tell you. So 613 commandments. Now, no doubt you've heard the following line. It's a song. Many kids learn it in Hebrew school. Torah tziva lanu Moshe. Moses commanded us the Torah. Now, here's the thing that I want you to see. The word Torah, right? Moses commanded us Torah. Now, we generally understand Torah to mean Torah, the 5 books of Moses. But the rabbis understood it differently. They said Torah is really a gematria. The letter Taf equals 400 in Hebrew. The letter Vav equals 6. The letter Resh equals 200. The letter He equals 5. So if you add this up, 400, 200, 600, plus 606 plus 5 equals 611. So according to the rabbis, when it says, Torah tziva lanu Moshe, Moses commanded us Torah, it doesn't mean Moses gave us the 5 books of Moses. It means Moses gave us 611. It was Moses who commanded the Jews to observe 611 commandments. But wait a minute, Rabbi Simlai already taught us that there are 613 commandments. So how do we account for the difference? The difference is God began with the first 2 commandments. People freaked out, turned around, ran away, and then when they were brought back, Moses said, fine, I'll give you the rest. And then Moses gives the people what was left, 611. So there we come up with the 613. So I want you to think about that idea, the deeper, not just the story, but the deeper idea of why the rabbis are telling us, oh, the people heard 2 commandments from God. 611 they heard from Moses. You know, here's what I think can happen. Sometimes a poet, a prophet, a priest, a mystic has an experience of God. And then he wants to share that experience. So what does he do? He writes a poem, he writes a haftarah, maybe he comes up with rituals. The idea is he creates a way for the people to experience what he experienced. How do you do that? Well, the best that he could do is either a description of the event. Not sure that it's going to work. What may work is a ritual. You do this, and this will bring you closer to God. So in a sense, we have rituals, laws, customs, traditions. There's a problem with this idea. The people are missing that experience of the divine, right? And for most people, the rituals don't help them achieve it. You had to be there, right? Moses was there. He experienced God. The people may not have. So they didn't have that experience. But here's the key. It was not God who gave most of the Torah, 611 of the commandments. It was Moses. And perhaps Moses created them himself, right? Now, if that's the truth, then here's another problem. If some guy, not God, but some guy made it up, why do I have to listen to what he said? He's no better than me, right? It's one thing if God tells me, you better listen to God. But if some guy made up 611 and Moses was the one who taught Torah, right, then why am I obligated to do what he tells me? So here's the classic example, in my opinion. You know, in the book of Leviticus, chapter 18, we're told the famous laws against homosexuality. A man shall not lie with a man as he would with a woman. Now, if you believe that that comes from God, then what are you going to say? You know, God must have his reasons, even if we don't understand. And so you got to obey it, as difficult as that may be. But if this second view of what happened at Sinai is perhaps true, that it was only the first 2 commandments that came from God, and maybe it was Moses who came up with the rest, why do I have to listen to Moses? Especially 3,200 years later, how do I know what motivated Moses? Maybe he was only dealing with what he felt, with what he knew, with what he understood. Look, we still don't understand completely homosexuality, but we certainly understand it a lot better than somebody who lived 3,200 years ago. So if this is the case, then maybe every one of the 611 commandments, besides what God gave us, I am the Lord your God, you shall have no other gods beside me. Everything else is up to us to decide and think about and to ultimately determine, am I going to do that? Do I believe that? Is it meaningful for me? Is it going to help me in any way? Right? It's ultimately up to us. So that's the second way to understand what happened at Sinai. Let's look at the third way. This is the most interesting one of all. There was a Hasidic Rebbe named Menachem Mendel of Rymanov in Poland. And he was born in 1745, died in 1815. Left behind a book of his teachings and sermons called Torat Menachem. His name is Menachem. And Torah, the teaching of Menachem. And this portion is quoted by the great scholar of Jewish mysticism, Gershom Scholem. And he said, Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Rymanov said, you want to know what the Israelites heard at Mount Sinai? It was not the 172 words of the Ten Commandments. It wasn't even the 59 words of the first two commandments. It wasn't even the first word of the commandments, which was Anochi, I am the Lord your God, you shall have no other gods beside me. Anochi, what the people heard, according to the Hasidic Rebbe, Menachem Mendel, was the first letter of the first word. Okay, so what the people heard was God saying Aleph. Get that? God saying Aleph. Not even the whole word, Anochi, just God saying Aleph. Anybody who's been to Hebrew school knows what is the sound of Aleph. There is no sound. The Aleph basically takes on the sound of whatever vowel it might have. And the Rebbe, Menachem Mendel, is saying that what the Israelites heard at Sinai was God pronouncing the Aleph. What does that mean? This is craziness. What's going on here? So the idea is that there was an experience. It was not an auditory one. It was experiential. The people, they didn't hear anything, but they had a sense that they were in the presence of God, even without hearing 172 words, 59 words, one word. They heard nothing, the letter Aleph. But that hearing of the letter Aleph, that experiencing it, was so great that it changed everyone who was there. You know, one of the great Jewish philosophers of the 20th century was Martin Buber, most famous for his book, I and Thou. And Buber says there is a difference between religion and religiosity. Religion, as you may know, comes from the Latin root religare, which means to bind. In other words, it's laws, rules, regulations, things that God tells you and you have to do. Basically, Buber rejects the notion of religion. Instead, Buber believes in the notion of not religion, but religiosity. So what is the difference? Religion says, do this, do that. Religiosity is a sense of an experience of the divine. It's about creativity. It's about spontaneity. It's about a living communion with God. The individual, not the group, but the individual seeks communion to God. I want to know God, just like Moses did on Mount Sinai. I want to understand who God is, what God wants of me. How do you do that? How do you get this experience of God? Well, there are several ways. One way would be prayer. It's us down here addressing him up there and hoping that he'll listen and somehow answer. And if it's not prayer, then perhaps you access God through study, right? Here we have, according, if you believe it, the words of God. So by my studying God's words, in a sense, it's not me sending my words up to God. I'm trying to bring God down to the words that he gave me. So prayer, study. Here's another way people try to commune with God. It's through ritual. Maybe it's putting on tefillin. That's so powerful. I put a tallis over my head. I wrapped tefillin around my arm and around my forehead. And maybe that, in a sense, draws me closer to God. Or maybe I light candles on Yantiv or on Shabbos. And as I light those flames and as I gaze into the fire, in a sense, God is right there with me. Or maybe I go to the mikveh, and by immersing in the water, it's as if, and I come out, I'm reborn, I'm a new person. I've been touched by God. You know, there are even people, we heard a lot of this in the 60s, there are people who feel that the way to God is through drugs. There are people who, for religious reasons, would turn to LSD, or we read about Native Americans or other tribes who often use different kinds of drugs in order to achieve a vision of the God that they believed in. Here's another way, a Jewish, very Jewish way of trying to have an experience of God. It's the performance of ma'asim tovim, of acts of chesed, of good deeds. You know, sometimes by helping somebody, giving a hungry person food, giving a person without clothing a warm coat, finding shelter for somebody who's homeless. We have a sense that, you know, we access God. Right? To love another person is to see the face of God, as they say in Les Mis. Another way of accessing God is through asceticism, whether it's fasting, or whether it's people used to whip themselves or roll in the snow or go into freezing cold water. That idea of tearing yourself away from the pleasures of the world and bringing you to the essence of the world, to God himself. And there are people who find God in a sunset or in a sunrise or in a flower, in the beautiful things of nature. Now, if that's the case, then it didn't happen 3,200 years ago, this experience of God. It could happen today. Here's the problem. There are not too many people who really care, who on the top of their to-do list is, you know what I need to do? I need to access God. I need to experience God. Not many people really care. And if they do care, not many people really succeed. You could put on tefillin, you could light candles, you can go in the mikveh, you could study the Torah, you could pray all day, and it could leave you cold. And there's nothing. And even if you can achieve connection with God through any of these means, how often does it happen? I mean, once in a lifetime? Once a year? It's not going to be a daily kind of thing. And here's another problem. It's ultimately just you and God, even if it does work. It's about the individual. It's not about the community. Our first story, the Jews heard all the 10 commandments. There were 600,000 men and 600,000 women and maybe 1.5 million children or more. 2 million people were at Sinai. It was a group experience. Now, if you are successful, then ultimately, because of, I felt that I connected with God. Either I experienced God, I saw God, I was in the presence of God. Just like Moses at the burning bush took off his shoes and bowed down to the ground because he had a sense that he was in the presence of the divine, of the holy. So if you have that, what does that lead you to? What good is it? Where does it get you? Well, it gets you to the famous question of the prophet Micah, who said, Ma Adonai doresh mimcha. What does God demand of you? If you were in the presence of God, you don't just say, boy, that was fun. Maybe I'll try it again next month. If you're in the presence of God, you have a sense that God requires something of me. Christians often speak about WWJD. If you want to know what you should do in any given situation, the question is always WWJD. What would Jesus do? And if you could remember the Gospels and you can access Jesus, you'll figure out the answer. Jews have a different approach. Not what would Jesus do, but WWGWYTD. What would God want you to do? Right? That's ultimately what happens if you're in the presence of God. You ask the question, what does God want me to do? Micah had his own answer, right? It's to love mercy and to do justice and to walk humbly with God. So he reduces it to 3 commandments. So let's just sum up. What have we got? The question is, what happened at Sinai? Well, the Jews heard all the 10 commandments. If they heard them from God, they're obligated to observe them. And you, as part of the people who were there, or as a descendant of the people who are there, then you're obligated to fulfill the 613 commandments. But there's another approach. What did our people hear at Sinai? Only the first 2 commandments. The others came from God, from Moses. He was the one that brought us. It was Moses who gave us the 611 commandments. Now, if that's the case, then we're obligated to believe in one God, not to be idolaters. But ultimately, we can question the 611 commandments that Moses himself gave us. Or maybe you follow the view of the Hasidic Rebbe, Menachem Mendel of Rimenov, who said what the people heard was the letter Aleph. And there was an experience. You need to try to have that same kind of experience. And then you as an individual, you need to try to figure out what God is asking of you. So we're celebrating Shavuot. We're celebrating the giving of the Torah and the 10 Commandments. But ultimately, we're challenged to figure out which of the 3 scenarios do I believe in, and what does each of those scenarios require of me in my life. So we're going to end with the cantor sharing with us one more Shavuos-based song.
Shkoch. So we just spent the last 7 weeks counting from the second night of Passover to last night. 7 weeks, the Shavuot, the 7 weeks from Passover to Shavuos. And I'm going to sing a melody that goes with the words that are part of the Sfirat HaOmer, the counting of the Omer. And it means the following. For the sake of the unification of the transcendent creative power with the divine presence dwelling here and now, I am here. I am ready to fulfill the mitzvah of counting the Omer. 7 weeks. They must be complete, and they are. This is a setting by Rabbi Yosef Goldman, who's part of the Hadar Rising Song Institute. L'shem yichud, kudsha brichu u'shechinte, hineni mu'achad u'mezuman, lekayim mitzvat aseh, shel sfirat ha'omer, shel sfirat ha'omer, shel sfirat ha'omer, shel sfirat ha'omer, sheva Shabbatot Temimot tiyena, Sheva Shabbatot Temimot tiyena, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, Asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu, Sfirat HaOmer, Sfirat HaOmer, Sfirat HaOmer, Sfirat HaOmer, Sheva Shabbatot Temimot tiyena, Sheva Shabbatot Temimot tiyena. Ay, 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 ay,
Yontif.